Hello everybody, my name is Josh Harnagel, and I'm the Vice President of Marketing for Redbird Flight Simulations. I also happen to be a CFI, II, and an MEI, and I have a lot of experience with the topic we're going to be dealing with today. Specifically, what I want to talk about is proficiency, pilot proficiency, and the problems that we have as an industry in ensuring that pilots stay proficient, get proficient, and like I said, stay that way. So when we really talk about proficiency, it's obviously a hot topic. There's a lot of activity in the industry geared towards getting general aviation pilots to maintain a certain level of proficiency. This is a tricky problem, though, when we really dig into it, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the solutions and some of the tools that are available to us to help pilots maintain proficiency, or as instructors to help your students build a tool set for once they leave your care. But before we get into that, I actually kind of want to dive into the problem just a little bit. This may be redundant, but I think it's important to really understand the problem that we have as an industry with proficiency. So first off, the number one cause of accidents is, I think everyone should know this, pilots. Pilots cause more accidents, according to the NTSB, than any other factor combined, aircraft, weather, etc. And when you really dive into a lot of the accident reports, at the root level, there's a decision that the pilot made, even if the proximate cause of it was, weather or something like that. The pilot chose to fly in those conditions, and so functionally, that's a problem with the way the pilot's thinking, the decisions they're making, or their proficiency with the physical acts or skills of flying or the procedures around flying. So when we think about the number one killer of pilots, the number one reason for accidents, it is without a doubt pilots, the actual pilot in command of the aircraft. So what's the best way to prevent accidents? Pretty straightforward, proficient pilots. The airlines have proven this, the military has proven this. When you look at the level of training that goes into a professional pilot, an airline pilot, they are at a reach and maintain an incredibly high level of proficiency, and that is the absolute guardrail around safety. Sure, there's a lot of advancements in the cockpit technology, there's a lot of extra tools that the pilots have available to them now than they did in the 70s when the commercial airline record wasn't quite as good. But functionally, at the end of the day, they train, professional pilot trains every 6 months on a range of skills and is put into situations that really push them and force them to maintain their proficiency. So I think there really shouldn't be a lot of debate about this. Functionally, the best way to ensure safe flight is to have a proficient pilot at the cockpit, no matter what the technology or the specific equipment that aircraft has. So why is it hard to be a proficient pilot? And again, I'm talking mostly in the general aviation space. So proficiency is a goal, and it's sort of an amorphous goal that's really hard to define, especially when you're talking about someone who's flying for either fun or for business, where it's not their primary occupation. And most pilots don't have a proficiency goal. So how can you say, I'm going to be a proficient pilot, if you have no way to define what that means to you, what the goal is? And achieving a goal requires a plan. A goal without a plan is a dream, right? So we have to, if we're going to say our goal is to be a proficient pilot and we define it thus, then we need to come up with a plan to reach that point. And most pilots, therefore, don't have a plan. They certainly don't have a goal, and even if they do have a proficiency goal, they don't have a plan to actually maintain it or to reach that level of proficiency. And a proficiency plan requires practice, and this is practice on the specific tasks that build up to being a proficient pilot. And traditional practice is very time-consuming and expensive. You have to go out to the airport, you have to book the plane, you have to pre-flight it, all the stuff to go out and do some maneuvers that you think will help ensure your proficiency. That costs money and time, and those are both resources that somebody who's not doing this professionally doesn't have a lot of. So that leads us to the third problem. Pilots don't practice. They don't practice towards proficiency. So in summary, pilots don't have a goal, have a plan, or practice. And therefore, pilots are the #1 cause of accidents. It's pretty circular, but that's where we get back to. We need these sort of building blocks to get us to a point where the general aviation accident rate can come down dramatically, and where we can feel really safe as an industry and comfortable as an industry with the pilots that are out there. So today, we've kind of talked about the problem. The things that we're going to cover is how would you make, or how would you help your students make a goal, a plan, and set aside time to practice for this proficiency. And then last but not least, I'm going to touch very briefly on the idea that maybe there's something we can do at Redbird to make this process a little bit easier. So first off, what is a proficiency goal? All right. Again, let's start. What's proficiency? Webster says it's a high degree of competence or skill, expertise. Some of these synonyms are, I think, helpful. They help me. Adeptness, excellence, mastery, professionalism. That's one I really like, especially in this context, because a proficient pilot flies like a professional pilot in a lot of ways. And I think in our head, we kind of know what a proficient pilot looks like or acts like, but it's hard for, there's no established sort of box in the industry that says this is what a proficient pilot should be like. We have the ACS standards, but those are really the minimum criteria. That's literally what the FAA is saying, is that this is the minimum criteria to be a private pilot, or the minimum criteria to be an instrument pilot. That's not the FAA coming out and saying this is what a proficient pilot looks like. And thankfully, we live in in the U.S. we live in a regulatory structure where the government defines minimums, not we don't regulate sort of that proficiency. It's up to the individual pilot to do that, which opens up the opportunity for more people to fly, I think. But as instructors, one of the main things we need to impart, especially on our private pilot students and our instrument students when they're beginning their flying career, is the idea that they need to come up with a goal for their proficiency, how to measure that and how to maintain it over time, and the plan to support it. So just to cover the bases here, current doesn't mean proficient. I think that gets a lot of play, and we know this. But just because you've done 3 landings in 180 days or 6 approaches in 6 months doesn't mean that you are proficient as a pilot. Proficiency is a much more complex topic than specific numbers in a logbook, right? Somebody like me, who I flew professionally as a flight instructor for about a year and a half, and logged a ton of time in a ton of different aircraft, in a bunch of different situations, did a lot of cross-country instrument instruction, and I came out of that with a really solid base of knowledge and skill. That was 10 years ago, well, more than 10 years ago. Over time, that base still exists, but it's degrading if I don't continue to fly. Somebody like me, a year removed from that experience, might only need 1 or 2 flights to be back fully proficient. And the same person, me, 10, 12 years now away from that experience, is probably going to need more practice and a more diligent plan to maintain the level of proficiency I had when I was a full-time flight instructor. So what's a personal proficiency plan? The reason I use personal proficiency plan is that that's an actual FAA word. The FAA says that in AC 6198D that pilots should maintain or should develop an individually tailored plan for their proficiency. This is the FAA specifically saying, hey, just because you're current, it doesn't mean you're proficient. Again, this is an AC, this isn't regulatory, but it's good information. And if you're an instructor or a pilot, I highly recommend looking at AC 6198D. There's a lot of really good information in it, and I'll pull out some of the worksheets and stuff like that a little in the next slide. But it goes into all kinds of detail about BFRs and IPCs and all that kind of stuff, and it's good reading. So the FAA has said, hey, pilots, build a personal proficiency plan. Tailor it to what you do, what your mission is, what you want to accomplish. And this is all really good guidance. Again, though, they don't tell you what that proficiency looks like. So it's kind of up to us. The FAA has some worksheets to kind of help you work through this. Some people respond well to this. This isn't really my style, but we're going to kind of go through my plan here in a little bit. But the FAA puts together this, it's a sample pilot's personal aeronautical goals, where they say these are the things, the goals that you want to achieve in your training, or the personal proficiency goals, and then they have a little block at the end for your training plan of action. So this is useful, interesting information, and maybe this would be a good thing for you to do with a student before their check ride, so that they at least have it on paper once, and they've worked through this concept once with an instructor before they actually go take the check ride. Appendix B from the same AC talks about how to build a specific practice plan. So they're recommending the FAA is recommending every 4 to 6 weeks, a VFR pilot goes out and does these things: steep turns, power on stalls, power off stalls, ground reference maneuvers, that kind of stuff. That's all really good, and you should certainly work on maneuvers. I think the FAA, in general, this is both on the testing side as well as the proficiency side. They tend to be more focused on maneuvers, and historically really focused on maneuvers. We're trying to move towards a more scenario-based training and scenario-based evaluation program. That's kind of what the ACS was designed to do. But it's still really hard to objectively measure scenarios given the technology that's available and the tools that are available to us. So we tend to default back to, let's do steep turns and ground reference maneuvers and that kind of stuff, demonstrate that we have physical mastery of the airplane. But I think, there are some really, there's a great book that every instructor should read, but I'm blanking on it. It's like Why Pilots Die, I think is the name of it, but it's about the killing zone. That's what it's called, and it's about that sort of time in a pilot's career between about 100 hours and 300 or 400 hours of training of total time, where the accident rate tends to be much higher than it does in other portions of a pilot's career. And when you dive into it, really, it's about judgment. It's about decision making. It's not about the physical skills of flying. Your average flight that is an accident flight doesn't involve steep turns or ground reference maneuvers or slow flight. It involves a cross-country trip through weather. It involves a pilot making a bad decision somewhere along the way and getting themselves into a situation where it doesn't matter how good they are at controlling the airplane. They're just in a bad spot. So we don't really have a lot from the FAA's point of view of guidance on how to train for that, but there are tools that are available. There's something called Pilots Workshops that's available. There's just reading the accident reports, reading Never Again, or I Learned From That, the different stories that the aviation publications produce, and sort of mentally thinking through some of these scenarios. And I think we'll touch on this in a little bit, but this is an area where I think Redbird can really help. Okay, so the FAA also doesn't ignore our instrument pilots. In the same AC, in Appendix H, we have an instrument training and proficiency plan, very similar to the private pilot or VFR instrument training plan. And they have a similar worksheet that talks about how to a practice flight for instrument skills. Again, mostly focused on procedural stuff or physical skills around the manipulation of the airplane, not decision making. Really. So, like I said, those worksheets are good. It's a good starting place, and we should at least do those. But for me, personally, I'm not a worksheet kind of guy. I like to think a little more free form. And since I left being a flight instructor, now I function mostly in a business environment and a business plan, product planning kind of place. And so when I approached this problem, my mind naturally went to the idea of creating a business plan, functionally a business plan for my proficiency. So this is, the next few slides are just sort of my plan for how I will personally maintain proficiency, and I lay it out in a way that makes sense to me. This is not to say that it's the way that you should do it or that your students should do it. It's more as an example that we need to meet our students where they are, we need to meet ourselves where we are, and develop a plan that fits our needs and is workable, is functional, right? We can't just make a plan that we have no intention of keeping or no ability to keep. Okay, so a plan is made up of, in this scenario, a plan is made up of 5 components: a mission, objectives, policy, procedures, and budgets, starting at the highest level and working down to the sort of granular, nitpicky kind of level. So a mission. The purpose of the organization, it dictates its fundamental purpose, describes exactly what it wants to achieve. So for me, a mission around my flying, instead of organization, substitute me. Master the art and science of aviation. That's one that appeals to my more philosophical background, I guess. It may not be really too concrete, though. So I also put in the idea of I want to feel confident in my ability to perform at my level of certification or higher. So I specifically lay out an objective and a way to measure that objective. So I want to feel confident in my ability to perform at my level of certification or higher. Again, this is really where we have a kind of a gap right now, because when we start this plan with just about anybody, it's all going to boil down to they feel confident. So we're self-measuring our proficiency, which is, it's all we got currently, but it's probably a little flawed. There's a lot of research around rationalization and basically deluding yourself into feeling confident when you're not actually, your skill set is not actually up to par. Ties into self-esteem and all kinds of kind of deeper, more complicated things that we probably don't, as instructors, necessarily need to dive into. But right now, that's our best bet. I will say, let's see, it's EAA through the IMC VMC clubs and their Proficiency 365 program has partnered with Cloud Ahoy to produce a little widget that grades proficiency. It's kind of a broad grade. It's mostly has to do with hours in the last 30 days or 90 days and sort of how you performed on some maneuvers. You have to link your Cloud Ahoy account. You do need a paid Cloud Ahoy account to do it, but that's kind of the only objective measurement we have right now out there. So on the objectives front, so objectives are the results. They represent the results that me or the organization aims to reach in order to achieve its mission, short-term goals or targets. So, for example, my objective would be log 50 hours plus in an airplane a year, fly an airplane twice a month, fly instrument procedures in a simulator twice a month, and fly 2 long cross countries in a year. These are my objectives, are specific things that I can measure that I believe I do these things, it will help me achieve my mission. These are stepping stones to the mission. They're not, the actual outcome. The outcome is being a proficient pilot, feeling confident in my abilities. Policies, these are kind of your statements of understanding or course of action. These are the things that guide your decision making. A lot of the FAA guidance on being a proficient pilot or just being a pilot in general boils down to policy creation. Things like I'm safe and PAVE and CHAPS and all that kind of stuff. Those are policies essentially that the FAA has developed and put out there and said these are good policies for people to follow to ensure their safety. And I support all of those initiatives. I add a couple other policies, like personal weather minimums are a huge one and should probably be the first thing that you set when you are building your own set of policies or helping your customer build a set of policies. For me, I feel very confident in my instrument abilities. I fly the sim a bunch. It's the area that I feel strongest in, actually. As a pilot, I would rather do an ILS to minimums than I would a chandelle. So for me, it's decision height plus 100 feet, visibility minimums plus half mile, and staying out of the red. I never ever want to penetrate a thunderstorm, and staying out of the red involves a whole lot of decision making. It involves understanding NEXRAD, onboard radar if you have it, and weather link delays and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot wrapped into that statement, but it's really key. If you, getting into, especially in the South where I fly, getting into a strong cell is a good way to have a short flight. I also intend to fly with a CFI once a quarter. This is harder for me, but it is a policy that I need to try to meet. And the big one is I never shoot an instrument approach in the airplane before I do it in the sim. This drives a lot of simulator use because to really meet this policy, what that means is if I'm going to an airport, I need to fly every approach at that airport on the sim at least once, and I probably need to fly every approach at 3 or 4 nearby airports at least once in case I need to divert or have an alternate. Now clearly, if the weather or the airplane condition dictates that I shoot an approach someplace that I haven't done it before, I'll obviously do that, but my goal is to never put myself into that situation. So that policy helps me be prepared when I get to the destination airport, but it also drives me to actually just do a bunch of instrument procedures in the simulator beforehand, which helps me stay sharp for sure. Procedures. Procedures are sort of the exact things that we're going to do in order or in like the next steps that we're going to take to help us reach our objectives. So essentially, if you look at it from a hierarchy, a mission is at the very top, objectives are the sub-steps of that, and then policies and procedures combine to help us reach our objectives. So for procedures, I schedule flights 3 months in advance, and this is specifically because I have a toddler, I'm busy at work, my schedule is ridiculous, and so it can get very hard for me to say, oh, I'll fly next week. Because when next week comes, I'll look on the calendar and I will have no time. There will be no space for me to do that. So if I for my personal schedule, need to stay several months ahead of it and put those on the calendar so I don't get booked, and so I dedicate that time. That may not be the case for everybody, right? And I intend to fly the sim every Thursday or every other Thursday. I have access to it at the office, so I can jump in the sim, so that it's a little easier for me, I get that, but if you're at a flight school that has the ability for students to come in without an instructor and use the sim, which I think is a great thing and we should promote more and more, maybe block time for individual uses and have people schedule that time, whatever can work for you. But I think having scheduled, repeat, frequent time on the simulator is just a great policy and procedure to put in place for people, and it'll help a lot. So I have a written goal for every flight, and I log the outcome. So this means the goal could be just fly from here to there, right? But I try to expand it a little bit. If I'm going on a flight, I want to say, I want to fly this at instrument check ride standards or higher the entire time, or I want to, while I'm flying this flight, I want to learn this new function in ForeFlight, or whatever the case may be. But I try to write down a goal for that, and I'm big on accountability, personal accountability, and so I log the outcome of that. Whether I did it or not, put it in a logbook, and not necessarily in a logbook, but in some organized way to keep track of that. This is in addition to logging the flight in your logbook, but you can use the notes section, whatever the case may be. And I think this actually really applies all the way down to the first lesson that somebody takes. Having written goals and objectives for every flight is really key. And ideally, knowing what the objective or goal will be for the next flight is really key, because even subconsciously you could be preparing for that before that happens. And then this last one is this is really a workaround for me because of the way my mind works, but it can be helpful for certain people. The FAA, or the aircraft manufacturer, produces a checklist. It's in the POH. That's the official checklist. There are other commercially available checklists that have other items on them or formatted in a different way. What I do typically is, if I'm starting in a new airplane, I will take the POH checklist. I will run through that several times over the course of several flights. And then I will sit down with it and I will build a personal checklist for me based off the POH. So I include all the items in the POH, plus others. So I'll include things like make sure ForeFlight is on this page, or load a backup approach in the flight plan before you take off in case we need to come in. Things like that. And just the process of going through that checklist really helps enforce systems knowledge and aircraft knowledge on that specific airplane, and it helps me think through the flight in terms of the whole arc of it, and not just before takeoff, before taxi, all that kind of stuff. And I can think about a checklist sort of from start to finish. What does that flight look like? And finally, a budget. I think this is we tend to skip this part with our students because it can be kind of a difficult conversation. But flying for fun or even for business is not a cheap thing. It can be affordable, and it can be, for certain people, it can be actually extremely valuable to do, but it's not cheap. So we need to, if we're going to take it seriously, we need to approach the dollar issue, the money issue, from the beginning and say, this is what our budget will be for flying, and allocate those dollars before they get allocated someplace else. And setting a monthly amount or a quarterly or yearly amount, whatever the case may be, whatever works for someone's budget, I think is a really strong way to do it. And especially somebody where flying is probably not affordable, right? Somebody like, honestly, I can fly, but it's really, I'm making sacrifices to fly frequently. And if I have a budget and say, this is how much I'm going to spend on it, it makes the decisions about whether I go to Starbucks today or not easier. Every $5 latte that I don't get is, some fraction of a time in the airplane. But functionally, we have to have a budget, or else people just won't follow through on this. It'll just be too expensive, and for some people, the budget may be more about time than it is about dollars. So I think it's a fair conversation for an instructor to have with someone, even if you don't go through their personal finances, but to talk about what does it cost to maintain and keep up your level of proficiency over time, even outside of pursuing a new rating or license. Okay, so that's kind of working through my plan about how to stay, or building out my plan for how to stay proficient. I throw this slide in here, it's ideas for staying proficient, just to kind of cover some bases about things you could do in the sim, really. Most of this stuff is pretty straightforward, but there are, one of the things that people struggle with, a lot of people struggle with, is talking on the radios. There are two services that I'd recommend, VATSIM or Pilot Edge, depending on, VATSIM is more for home simulator use, Microsoft Flight Sim, that kind of thing, and Pilot Edge would be for typically used in schools and that. You can do a home simulation with Pilot Edge. There's two different sort of product tiers, though. VATSIM is generally more popular with sort of the gamer flight sim community, and there is some training that you have to take to be a VATSIM controller, but it's not guaranteed that it's going to be like it is in the real airplane. Pilot Edge uses actual controllers. They do function on a kind of smaller geographic area, and they are more expensive, but if you're struggling with talking on the radios and keeping everything, working through those procedures, Pilot Edge might be a smart investment, at least for a short time, to kind of help you with that while you're at home. Excuse me. And then an easy one, the plan and fly an upcoming route before you get to the airplane. I think that's pretty straightforward, but and that kind of ties into shooting an instrument approach at every airport, or all the instrument approaches at every airport before you get there, and then working on your avionics, that kind of stuff. The last slide in this section here is effective simulator use, and this is part of my best practices for instructing in a Redbird, which is also available during migration, and I'd recommend that you look at that. But if you're going to use the simulator at home, these rules, or by yourself, or help your students use a simulator by themselves, these rules still apply. It's having a goal for every situation, keeping things realistic, trying to have a learning objective for the scenario, not just, you don't want to make it a game, you don't want it to be, and you don't want it to be on the just awful, totally ridiculous, like there's no possible way to escape. So there's got to be some kind of realistic objective that you want to accomplish in the sim, and knowing when to pause. The pause button is the most powerful button in the simulator. I harp on that a bunch, but I think it's probably abused. People pause more frequently than they should. Essentially, if the student is still learning, don't pause. If they're overwhelmed and learning has stopped, that's when you pause the simulator. And the pilot can do that themselves. If they feel like they may be able to catch up, let the simulation run. If you feel like you're so far behind that you're overwhelmed, that's when you pause and try to catch up while the simulation's not running. Okay, last but not least, can Redbird make this easier? So, yes, I think we can. We have a couple tools at our disposal. One, we have simulators that we build and maintain all over the world, all over the country, both at home and in flight schools. We've built out a technology suite called Trace, but it's what drives our guided independent flight training program, GIFT, and it does grading based on performance of maneuvers at this point, but it could be expanded to do grading based on flight outcomes, like did they land at an airport or did they crash? Things that would be measurable, a way to measure judgment, decision making. And last but not least, we have the tools to build scenarios. We've built some scenarios in the past for various sort of special use cases, things like the Pilot Proficiency Center at Oshkosh or the Webster competition in Canada. But we have some experience and the tool set needed to build sort of long-form scenarios. When you combine all that together, what you can get is you have the foundation of objective measurement of proficiency and the ability to potentially recommend scenarios or tasks that a student or a pilot would need to do to improve their proficiency. So I will say we are working on that right now. It's been we've been slowly working on it for about, I'd say 6 months in earnest, and I expect to have something interesting to talk about in the first quarter of next year. But I think there's a lot of potential here for schools that have Redbirds to help existing pilots maintain their proficiency, improve their proficiency over time, and really provide a valuable feedback mechanism to the student or the pilot, as well as a revenue opportunity for the school. So with that said, I think you should be on the lookout for some new tools, some new products from us, really built around the idea that we can help pilots maintain and improve their proficiency over time. So that's the presentation. I appreciate your time today. Thanks for joining us at Migration, and feel free to send me a message if you have any questions, and we'll be in touch. Thanks.